cheese in the box until you need to use it. But let's just talk a little bit now about storing cheese and how's the best way to store it. I think that's what most people want to know. Well, if you buy cheese from a supplier like this, what they do is they wrap the cheese in paper which has got wax on one side of it, and that's very good, and you can actually buy that paper yourself, special waxed paper. Now if you can't get waxed paper, you can use this here, and this is just ordinary parchment paper, the kind that you use for baking or lining cake tins. And then what you do is, as they've done here, just fold the cheese up in the paper and then just use a bit of sticky tape to seal it down, or you can I've even used elastic bands just to seal it down. So that's the best kind of paper. Cling film isn't good and foil isn't so good either, so that's the way you store your cheese. Now, in the refrigerator or out of the refrigerator? Well, this is a personal taste really. Best, the cheese experts say, out of the refrigerator. I would say go by the weather. If it's a very warm day, then I think you're probably better off in paper like this in the lowest part of the refrigerator. Put it in the box that the refrigerator has for cheese, but don't close the lid. Leave a little bit of air going in. It needs a bit of air. If it's not a hot day, two places I can recommend storing cheese. One is in the garage. That's a good place. And if you haven't got a garage, you live in a flat, then another good place, if the weather isn't too hot, is to store your cheese in the boot of a car. I've often done that, and that works very, very well. Well, now we're going to look at how to make a perfect cheese board to finish a meal off with some nice red wine. But first of all, I've forgotten to mention one thing that people are often asking me, and what happens when you get a mould on the cheese? Well, it's perfectly all right, just slice off the mould and the cheese underneath will be all right. But when you want to really enjoy eating cheese, it's best not to keep it too long. If you can, eat it as soon as possible. Now, the perfect cheese board, I think, would consist of one blue cheese, and the one I want to show you here now is an Irish cheese called Cashel Blue. And then I'd have one medium soft cheese. When I've written my notes for you on cheeses, I've put them into groups of hard, soft, medium soft and so forth. So one medium soft cheese. This one is called Durras, that's also an Irish cheese. This one here is a goat's cheese. I think it's good to have one goat's cheese. This is called Paroche, it's an English fresh goat's cheese. And this one here is one of the supreme cheeses in the world. This is cheddar cheese, but it's unpasteurised, beautifully made cheddar called Montgomery cheddar, and that's a real star. Now, perhaps we ought to say something about pasteurisation. Well, cheese, like wine, comes from various areas, and it's a kind of earthiness of the minerals in the air and in the place the cheese is made that comes into the flavour. And what happens is when you heat treat milk, when you pasteurize it, it knocks out some of that extra added flavour. And so I would say that treat yourself sometimes to an unpasteurised cheese. Obviously, it's not a good idea if you're pregnant or to serve it to vulnerable groups like very young children or the elderly. But it is a treat for cheese lovers, and I would recommend it. Finally, I would have a soft cheese. This is also an unpasteurised cheese. This is a real proper French Normandy camembert, and one of the greatest cheeses in the world as well. And what you need to do with a camembert is serve it when it's really got lots of nice squidge in it. So I'm going to cut a piece out and we're going to hope it's got a lot of nice squidge in it. And good camembert shouldn't be sort of running. It should be just lovely and soft and creamy and squidgy. And when you buy camembert, it's got a date stamp on it, say that's in sort of 2 weeks' time, then just put it in the boot of the car and leave it for 2 weeks. Nobody can smell it if it's safely in the boot of the car. So that's a really good cheese board. Now we're going to move on and look at making some recipes with cheese. Well, when it comes to cooking with cheese, surely in this country the premier cheese dish must be toasted cheese or cheese on toast, whichever you like to call it. And there is a knack to making this, and the one I want to show you today involves 4 slices of quite well toasted white bread. I think white bread is crisper, and this needs to be from a large, good quality sandwich loaf. And what you do is you preheat the grill, always preheat the grill for about 10 minutes before you toast anything. Toast the bread, and then, as we looked at in part 1, you put the bread on a toasting rack so that it can become really nice and crunchy and crisp. Then you put it onto a baking sheet, leaving the grill on, and it's a good idea to line the baking sheet with foil because then it's easier to clean when the bits of cheese bubble over. So that's the toast, that's all ready to have the cheese now. And in my bowl here, I'm going to start off with a beaten egg, which gives it a sort of puffiness, a lightness and a puffiness. And then one traditional ingredient for making toasted cheese in this country is this, which is ale, brown ale. And I'm going to use 4 tablespoons of brown ale. 1, 2, 3, 4. And then I've got some flavouring ingredients here. First of all, a rounded teaspoon of mustard powder. And then I've got a rounded dessert spoon of grated onion. So that's going to go in. And then I'm going to use sage. 1 dessert spoon of freshly chopped sage leaves. The sage and onion have a lovely affinity with cheese. Just to give it a bit of a kick, I'm going to use some Worcestershire sauce, and again, a teaspoon of this will go in. Then I'm just going to give that little lot a whisk, and then add the cheese. And the cheese, in this case, is strong, matured, if possible, unpasteurised cheddar cheese. Now, what this dish is traditionally called is Welsh rabbit, or Welsh rarebit. It started off as Welsh rabbit, and I like the story of that. The reason it was called Welsh rabbit is because when the hunter came back and he had no luck, he hadn't found any rabbits, all he could have for his supper was toasted cheese. So I've called this Welsh rabbit with sage and onions. And now I'm going to just put that onto the toast, divide it equally, and then one little tip I'd like to give you here when all the cheese is on, bearing in mind that you're going to have a lot more time than I've got now, and that is you need to spread it with a knife, and you need to spread it right up to the end of the toast. So, final ingredient is going to be a little pinch of cayenne pepper, which will give it a lovely bit of piquancy. So that's going to go under the grill now, and it's going to take about 5 minutes to bubble and cook and turn brown. And then what happens is it gets lovely and toasted on the top and browned and bubbling. And if you've got any little escaped bits, then you can just nick them up off the foil, and, well, sometimes I just pick them up and eat them because they're really good. Now, I'm just going to show you one quick alternative version to cheese on toast, and this here is crumpets. And what I've done is toasted the crumpets, and I'm going to give them a different topping. Crumpets are wonderful with cheese because the cheese just melts down through into the little holes. And this is Gorgonzola cheese, and I've got 1.5 ounces of Gorgonzola cheese that's been cut into cubes like this. And then I'm going to put some mozzarella cheese, 1/2 ounce of mozzarella. That's going to go on top of the Gorgonzola. And then after that, some walnuts, which go really well with blue cheese. I've got 1/2 ounce of walnuts here. And what you have to do with the walnuts is you just have to poke them in amongst the cheese and try and get it all together like that. And then the final thing you do is you add 3 sage leaves that have been just dipped in olive oil. So they're going to go under the grill now, preheated grill again. And what happens to the sage leaves is they become really sort of crisp and crunchy. And that makes a lovely little snackette.
Cauliflower melds beautifully with the taste of Roquefort cheese, and together they make a sublime soup that only takes about 40 minutes to make. First you make a stock by adding bay leaves to boiling water. Then use the leaves and stalks from the cauliflower. Simmer this for 20 minutes. Meanwhile, sweat onion, celery, leek and potato in another pan. Add the cauliflower florets, and to these add the strained stock together with the bay leaves. After 20 to 25 minutes simmering, remove the bay leaves and liquidize the soup until it's smooth. Then add chives and stir in crumpled Roquefort cheese and half-fat creme fraiche. Keep stirring until the cheese has melted and the soup is very hot but not boiling.
Well, now we're actually going to come back to toasting cheese, but this time it's toasted goat's cheese. But before we deal with the goat's cheese, what it's going to be for is a salad with blackened sherry vinegar onions. And I want to show you first of all how to deal with the onions, and we'll get to the goat's cheese in a second. Well, the onions have a dressing, and the first ingredient that's going to go into my bowl here is 1 ounce of molasses sugar, which has a lovely flavour, and 3 fluid ounces of sherry vinegar. And what I'm going to do is just give those a quick whisk, because molasses sugar sometimes gets very sticky, and it's quite a good idea if you actually mix the vinegar with the sugar 10 minutes before you start, because then it has chance to dissolve. So what we're going to do now is just leave that aside while I explain the onions. And you need for this, the recipe is going to serve 4, and you need 3 Spanish onions, which is about 1 pound. You cut them in half, then into quarters, then into eighths, but you leave the root on, because what happens when you leave the root on is the layers stay together in little chunks like that, and that's what we want for the recipe. Then into the dressing I'm going to put 2 tablespoons of extra virgin olive oil, and then give that another whisk, and then the dressing is actually going to go onto the onions, or rather the onions are going to join the dressing, and we're going to toss them around in it. So we'll do that. Just use a spoon, and you can see quite clearly when the onions have all had a good coating with the dressing. It's important that you spend a little bit of time just tossing them over and over. And if there are any small little lumps of sugar left, it's nothing to worry about. Now what we're going to do is put the onions onto a nice large solid baking sheet, and any free dressing just gets spread around them like this. Spread them out and give them a good seasoning of salt and freshly milled black pepper. And what we're going to do is cook them in a very, very hot oven, highest temperature 450 degrees, and they're going to go on a high shelf, and they're going to take 30 minutes to cook all together, but you need to take them out at half time and just turn them over. And here they are, they're cooled now and ready to put into the salad. And I have to say that all that can be done well in advance, and you can just cover the onions with cling film and leave them at room temperature. I wouldn't put them in the fridge until you're actually ready to serve the salad. But now we're going to grill the goat's cheese. You can use any kind of goat's cheese you like, whatever's your favourite. I've got 2 different kinds here. One is a soft, mild goat's cheese, which is made in England. And this one is a French one. This is called crottin, and this has got a strong goaty flavour. So if you want to have a stronger flavour, I would recommend that one. A milder flavour, this one. If you're serving this one, you'll need 1 whole cheese per person, but this one you'll just need half. It's about roughly 4 ounces, and we're serving sort of 2 ounces per person. So what you do is you just cut the goat's cheese totally in half like that, and then you put it onto an oiled baking sheet. It's important that you have an oiled baking sheet. And then what I do is just put a little bit of freshly milled pepper onto the goat's cheese before it goes under the grill. And we've got the grill preheated as normal, and it's nice and hot, and we're going to put the cheese about 3 inches from the heat source, and it's going to take about 5 to 7 minutes to soften and become nice and golden on the top. So here's the toasted goat's cheese. Now all we need to do is prepare the salad, and the leaves I'm using here are a round curly lettuce with a little bit of rocket as well, the two mixed together. And what I'm going to do is just put the onions on the lettuce leaves on top like that. And then each person has some toasted goat's cheese in the centre of the salad like that. And then the dressing I'm using is the same dressing we made in the salad programme, the same vinaigrette dressing, which is sherry vinegar and balsamic vinegar. And then just before it goes to the table, just sprinkle some salad dressing all the way around like that. And any salad dressing you've got left over can go onto the table if anyone would like a bit extra. So there we are, that's toasted goat's cheese salad with blackened sherry vinegar onions.
Whether you're a vegetarian or not, this is a great supper dish. They're called cheese and herb fritters, and you can use any cheese as long as you have 12 ounces for 4 people or 6 ounces for 2 people. I'm using a mature cheddar, Gruyere and feta cheese, which you mix into a batter of plain flour and eggs. You then add chopped mixed herbs. I've got basil, thyme, oregano and parsley, but it's up to you. Cover the mixture and allow the flavours to develop for about an hour. Then flour your hands and mould a tablespoonful of the mixture into a round and dust it with flour. Heat oil in a frying pan until it's shimmering hot, then fry the fritters 1/2 at a time, turning them halfway before draining on crumpled greaseproof paper. I like to serve these with this, which is a sweet pepper marmalade, and perhaps a rocket or watercress salad.
Well, I've now got yet another brilliant cheese recipe to show you. This one is called Mexican enchiladas with cheese. Now, when you make enchiladas, the first ingredient you need is a packet of these, and these are called flour tortillas. They're very widely available. They have a long shelf life, so it's a very good standby ingredient to have, and you can make any kind of variation on the recipe I'm going to show you with lots of different fillings. Well, what do they look like? They look like this. And I'm going to actually be using 4 in the recipe. Very difficult to make, I believe, by hand, but these are all made for us. And the recipe's using 4. It makes a first course or a snack for 4 people, or a main course for 2 quite hungry people. Now, before we deal with the tortillas, we're going to make another Mexican ingredient that's going to go as part of the filling, and that's called a salsa. And when I actually did part 1 of How to Cook, we had a little cookery school on the Radio Times, and one of the pupils said to me, "Delia, do you think you could show me when you next do a television series how to chop an onion, because I don't know." And I've never done that, so here goes. This is specially for her. Now, the salsa involves a medium red onion. Now, what you do is you take the papery skin off the onion, and then you take the stalk end off with your knife, but you leave the root end intact, because this is going to make it easier for you. Then you first of all chop the onion in half, and you leave the root bit there, angle your fingers inwards so you don't slice your fingers off, and then you start going into slices like this. Now, if you want slices, that's all you do, you just slice them like that. But if you want the onion to be finely chopped, then you turn it round this way, and then you just start going in the opposite direction, holding your fingers in and going like that until you get right down to the end. And then you've got finely chopped onion, and that's how it's done. So we'll just get rid of the debris. And now over here, somebody's very finely chopped an onion already for me, and I can show you the salsa. First ingredient in the salsa is a large 400-gram tin of Italian tomatoes. And you empty these into a sieve and put them over a bowl, and in about 10 minutes all the juice will collect in the bottom, and we just need the drained tomatoes. So they're going to go into my bowl first. And I have tried the recipe with fresh tomatoes, but I found the actual tin tomatoes work better. Then the onion And I'm only going to put half the onion in because the rest is going to be used later on. Then I've got 2 tablespoons of chopped coriander leaves. They're going to go in. This is a fresh chilli that's been deseeded and chopped as we saw earlier in the series. So that's the chilli. It's a green chilli. And then all these ingredients are very Mexican, this one too, the juice of a fresh lime. Now all we're going to do is just mix that, and the whole thing begins to look very colourful and very Mexican at this stage. Now we're going to deal with the tortillas, and because they've been sort of sitting in the pack in the larder for a while, what you need to do is refresh them. So you use a hot frying pan and you just put the tortilla into the frying pan and count 6 seconds, 6 seconds only, and then when you've counted 6 seconds you just turn it over onto the other side, and what that will do is just bring it to life again. It's like sort of putting bread in the oven to warm it through. It just refreshes it. And what about the cheese? Well, the stars of this recipe are 4 ounces of Wensleydale and 5 of mozzarella. Wensleydale is quite a mild cheese, but it's the closest thing to the kind of cheese you would have in Mexico. And so what I'm going to do is just combine those together. And we're going to use the salsa and the cheese and one more ingredient to make a filling for the tortilla. So first of all, you use a tablespoon of salsa into each one. That's followed by a heaped tablespoon of cheese. The 2 cheeses mixed together. That's more like a heaped tablespoon. And then the other ingredient we're going to use is this, which is creme fraiche. And this is a small tub of creme fraiche. And I'm going to put a tablespoon of that in next. So you can begin to get the gist of how nice this is going to taste. Then what you do is you roll it up very carefully, like that, and you place the tortilla in a baking dish with the seam side, the bit I've rolled up here, down on the underside, just to keep it firm. Now, to save time, I've got them all prepared here, ready to go into the oven, and I'll just explain the next bit of the recipe. Once the tortillas have been put into a baking dish, the next thing you do is you put the rest of the creme fraiche that's left on top of them, and that is followed by the salsa, and then the cheese, and then the rest of the onion on top. And then that goes into a preheated oven, gas mark 4, 350 degrees, and they're going to take about 25 to 30 minutes to cook. Now, one thing I didn't tell you, and that is, if you leave little bits of tortilla sticking out without any filling on the top, they go nice and crisp and crunchy in the oven, which is very, very good. Now what I'm going to do is show you how to serve it, because what you need to do is be very careful that you separate them with a knife. And if you've got a nice big palette knife like this, you should be able to get it all out in one fell swoop. There we go. And what I like to do is just put a couple of leaves of coriander on the top before it's served. So there we are. That's Mexican enchiladas with cheese.
This is a different type of gnocchi from Italy, not made with potatoes this time, but with semolina. You sprinkle the semolina into milk along with nutmeg and seasoning. Bring it up to the boil and simmer for 4 minutes, whisking all the time until it's so stiff you can stand the spoon up. Remove it from the heat and beat in eggs and Parmesan cheese. Then pour the mixture into a tin lined with silicone paper, cool and chill overnight to firm up. Next day, turn the mixture out, peel off the paper and cut into 2-inch rounds with a pastry cutter. Then overlap the rounds on a dish with ricotta cheese and gorgonzola sprinkled over, finally some Parmesan, then bake on a high shelf for 30 minutes until they're golden brown.
Well, I'm not quite finished yet. I've got a couple more things to show you, but I'm also going to look forward to seeing you again next time.
These little tarts combine the flavours of goat's cheese and sage, and underneath there's red onions slowly cooked in balsamic vinegar. Then bake in the oven till squidgy and melted. The title of this one says it all. Curd cheesecake with Greek yoghurt, honey and pistachios. And this just happens to be our producer's favourite. Here I've got a cake, a mousse, puddings and a trifle, and they've all got one thing in common.
Well, sadly, this is the last in our series of programmes, but we're going to end on a high note because today the programme is all about chocolate. Now, chocolate is made from cocoa, pure cocoa which is grown and harvested from cocoa beans. And what you want to know when you buy a bar of chocolate is how much of that is in it. And there's a little thing on a little word on the label which says cocoa solids, and that's going to tell you how much chocolate you've got, because you wouldn't believe how much it varies. This one is one of the best around. This is 75% cocoa solids, and it's a dark continental chocolate with all the sophistication of full chocolate flavour. This one here has 70% cocoa solids, but this is something interesting too, because the cocoa beans are grown in the rainforests in West Africa, and it's actually organic. So if you want to buy organic chocolate, that's also a very good one. But somebody told me a little test recently of how to tell if you got a good bar of chocolate. There's no wrapper here and no label. So how do you tell? Well, apparently, if you just snap a little piece of chocolate, it's the difference in the sound. A good chocolate will have a good snap and a poor chocolate won't. So we'll just try that now and see what happens. That's the first snap. And let's go down to the 34% now and have another snap. See, it is quite different, quite different. Also, you may like to know, if you're a chocoholic or you really love eating chocolate, that there's now one chocolate maker in France who makes chocolate from individual suppliers of cocoa beans from around the world. So you can get a special variety of cocoa bean chocolate. They come in a pack of 7 bars, so you can have some fun and do a chocolate tasting, find out, which one you like best. They have 75% cocoa solids, and this one here is called Ceylan, and it's described as being full-bodied, without being aggressive, a rounded, warm taste with a hint of Asia. So I think it's just like a wine tasting. If you really like chocolate, you can experiment with that. Now we're going to make our first chocolate recipe in the programme, and I think it's important for everybody to know how to make a good old-fashioned chocolate mousse. And before we make the chocolate mousse, the first technique you have to learn when you're going to cook with chocolate is how to melt it successfully. So you start off with a saucepan with about an inch of water in it. And the water needs to be heated, but not to boiling point. It just needs to be barely off simmering point. So when we made poached eggs, you remember we looked at little bubbles on the base of the pan and we said that's the right temperature. Well, that's the right temperature for chocolate. So you can see the little bubbles at the bottom of the pan there. Last time I told you how to boil water, this time I'm telling you how not to boil it and just have little bits of bubbles like that in the bottom. So that's on the lowest heat. Then you put your bowl on top of your mixing bowl on top of the water, and then in goes the chocolate. And we're making chocolate mousse for 6, so we've got 2 bars of 75% dark chocolate, and that's about 7 ounces altogether. And then to the chocolate, I'm going to add 4 fluid ounces of warm water, just hand hot water. And then just push the chocolate into the water. What will happen now is the water will dull the chocolate and make it look a bit unexciting. But you're not to worry about that. If you leave the heat low and the bowl on top and go away for about 6 minutes, when you come back, the chocolate will be melted. And what happens when people melt chocolate and it seizes up and becomes stiff, what goes wrong is people get impatient. They don't want to wait 6 minutes, so up goes the heat, the water boils, and it's too much heat. You've got to have a gentle heat to melt chocolate properly. Well, once the chocolate has completely melted and turned lovely and smooth, the next thing you need to do is take it off the heat, turn the heat out, and leave it to cool whilst you deal with the next ingredient, which is separated eggs. I've got 3 eggs here, 3 egg whites in this bowl and 3 egg yolks in another bowl, and I'm going to start by whisking the whites. So we'll start that off. And the egg whites need to come up to the soft peak stage. Right, the eggs have now reached the soft peak stage. The next ingredient is some sugar, but before I add the sugar, I'm just going to steady the bowl by putting a cloth underneath it because I need both hands free. Now I've got 1½ ounces of caster sugar here, and I'm going to continue whisking, adding the sugar a little bit at a time. Those of you who are with me on part 1 will remember this is how we made meringue, and this is sort of like another version of a meringue, only with much less sugar. So that's the egg whites ready, and the next thing I'm going to do is just stir the yolks into the melted chocolate because it's now had a chance to just cool off a bit. So what I'll do is take the wooden spoon out and just slide the chocolate off it, and then get rid of that, add the 3 egg yolks. And they're just going to be folded in quite quickly, and then put 1 spoonful of the whipped whites to lighten the mixture. And then after that, carry on folding the egg whites in. So let's just have 1 tablespoon of egg whites first. There we go. That's going to be folded, and what you need to do now is remember that what you've just done is got lots of air into the egg whites, and you don't want to lose the air. So what you're going to have to do is be very patient and just use folding movements with your spoon. Just don't go in there and try and mix it in quickly. So you cut across the mixture and then you lift and fold over. Now I'm going to just take a clean spoon and we'll have another spoonful of egg whites. In fact, we'll have a couple. And when I used to make chocolate mousse in the early days, I just used to whip up the egg whites without adding any sugar. And sometimes, when I made a chocolate mousse, sometimes I'd have sort of liquid left at the bottom, which isn't very nice. But now I've cracked that. By adding a bit of sugar to the egg white, it sort of stabilises them and it helps you to keep it nice and moussey without it flopping. And because the chocolate is such a high cocoa content, it can take the sugar. So that's now ready to go into serving portions. It serves 6 and I'm going to put it into stemmed glasses. I quite like chocolate mousse in stemmed glasses, but if you don't want to put it in glasses, you can actually put it into little ramekin dishes. I've got one sitting there to show you, and it's a little bit more difficult to manoeuvre this into glasses, but I think at the end it does look sort of more elegant. And then when you fill 6 glasses, what you do is cover the surface with cling film and then chill them thoroughly in the refrigerator before serving. And I want you to see one now that's ready to serve because I want you to have a look at the texture. And there it is in all its glory, very luscious, very chocolatey mousse. And I always like to serve it with a bit of softly whipped cream on the top. One thing I think I need to mention is if you're making chocolate mousse, it does contain raw eggs, as you've seen, so it's not a good idea to give it to vulnerable groups. But before we finish chocolate mousse, I want you to see what the texture of the mousse is like. I think it's important that you just see inside. So I'm going to just show you that on a spoon. And that is beautiful, wonderful, very simple, but very lovely chocolate mousse.
This is definitely a chocolate cake for grown-ups. It's made with prunes soaked in Armagnac. To make the cake, take the yolks of 6 separated eggs and add them to 5 ounces of golden caster sugar. Beat them until they begin to thicken. Then add 2 ounces of cocoa powder, which you sift into the mixture and then fold it in. Next in go the egg whites, beaten first till stiff, then use 1 spoonful to lighten the mixture before carefully gently folding in the rest, trying not to lose any air. Then divide the mixture between 2 8-inch cake tins and bake on the centre shelf of the oven for 15 minutes. Prunes have to be soaked in Armagnac well in advance. First set a dozen aside, then put the rest in a processor with a heaped dessert spoon of crème fraîche and any of the soaking liquid. Then puree to make the cake filling. Next, dip the whole prunes in melted chocolate and use the remaining chocolate mixed with more crème fraîche to spread over the top of the cake before decorating with the prunes.
I'm now going to show you a really stunning recipe that is so easy to make, you just won't believe it. You start off with 8 ounces of dark, plain chocolate with 75% cocoa solids, and you melt it the same way as we melted it before, but without any water. You just melt the chocolate, and the reason it looks so lovely and glossy is because the chocolate, when it was melted, had 2 ounces of butter beaten into it. And I can give you a tip. If you want to melt chocolate and add any liqueurs or spirits, which we're going to do in a minute, we're going to add some rum. If you add them straight into the melted chocolate, it does sort of go grainy. So if you add butter first and get it all nice and glossy like this, then you won't have any problems. Now, the next ingredient that's going to join the melted chocolate and butter is this one here, which is double cream, and it's been sort of lightly whipped to the floppy stage. So I'm just going to add that. And just clean the bowl. And then I'm just going to stir the chocolate into the cream, combine the two thoroughly. Just needs a bit more mixing. It looks sort of marbly at the moment, and you just need to get all that sort of marble out of it so that it's a nice, evenly blended colour. And then the next ingredient is in my bowl here. It looks a bit peculiar, but what it is actually, it's 8 ounces of these, and these are oat biscuits that are very lightly sweetened. And what you do with them is you take the 8 ounces and just break them up into little pieces, and I would say these are roughly sort of 1/4 of an inch, 1/3 of an inch. It's not vital, but not too small because you're going to get some crunch in this. Now they're going to go in to the cream and the chocolate, and we're just going to give them a little mix to be thoroughly combined. And then the next ingredient I've got is the dried cherries that we used earlier in the series when we made the duck sauce. The dried sour cherries, I've got 2 ounces of those and 2 ounces of fat, juicy raisins, and these have been soaked overnight in 3 tablespoons of rum. So they're going to go in next. And then finally, I've got 4 ounces of pistachio nuts. You can buy these in packets ready shelled with no salt, especially for baking. And what I've done is I've just roughly chopped them. They, again, shouldn't be too small because we want lots of nice crunch. So we've got cherries, raisins, pistachio nuts and biscuits. And now I'm just going to give this another mixing. Now the name of this cake is Unbaked chocolate cake. It's sometimes called refrigerator cake because the lovely thing about it is it doesn't need any baking. It's just going to go into the refrigerator. But first of all, it's going to go into a tin. And I've got here an 8-inch cake tin that has been lightly oiled. It's 1.5 inches deep, and now we're just going to put the mixture in. And then, what you do then is you just smooth it out and press it down very, very firmly. And when you've pressed it down and got it quite even on the top, then just sort of pat it like that to give it a sort of rough surface. It's quite nice if it has a rough surface. Then you cover that with cling film and you put it in the refrigerator and leave it for a minimum of 4 hours to set and become firm. And guess what? We have one that's been in the refrigerator over here, and this is what it looks like. And before you serve it, it's quite nice to just dust the surface with some cocoa. I've got organic cocoa here, which is a very nice colour. And I'm just going to dust the surface with that. And then I think what you're going to want to do now is see inside it. So I'm just going to cut a piece out and let you have a look. It's quite crunchy and firm, the texture. But all those lovely, beautiful ingredients together give the most superb flavour and texture. And I would serve that with some chilled pouring cream.
This is a chocolate version of everybody's favourite dessert, crème brûlée. They have a caramel topping which hardens into a glassy caramel crust, covering the creamy chocolate cream.
Well, whenever I do a new book or a television series, there's always a kind of internal vote as to which recipe is going to be the recipe of that particular series. And this one I'm going to show you now has got the vote this time, but it'll only prove right when it gets to you and you start making it. And then we'll see. Well, the recipe is called melting chocolate puddings, and they're little baked puddings in the oven that have got inside melted chocolate, and it's all very clever and very wonderful. Now we're going to melt some chocolate first, but slightly different from the way we did it before. I've got my hot water here ready and my bowl, and I've got 7 ounces of dark 75% chocolate, which is going to go into the bowl, And I've also got 7 ounces of butter that has been cut into little lumps to make it melt quicker. And then I'm also going to add 2 tablespoons of brandy, which goes very, very well with chocolate. So 2 tablespoons of brandy. And then I'm just going to leave that, as we did before, it melts exactly the same way, just very, very slowly, and show you the next part of the recipe. Well, you need a nice big large roomy mixing bowl to start off with, and what I'm going to put first in my mixing bowl is 4 whole large eggs, and then here I've got 4 egg yolks. So you're going to have 4 egg whites left over, so what you could do is make a lovely big pavlova meringue if you wanted to, as well as the chocolate puddings. And then here I've got 4 ounces of golden caster sugar, and that's going to go in with the eggs. And then we're going to have some vanilla extract, and it's 1½ teaspoons of vanilla extract. Now we're going to whisk the eggs and the sugar together for quite a long time. What happens is it's whisked and we get lots and lots of air in it, and it doubles in volume, and then I'll show you the next stage. So you need a good strong whisk, and it's going to take about 5 minutes to whisk it if you've got a strong